In this video, we are going to go through the basic parts of the user interface of Blender 3D. This is the 3D viewport. This is essentially the main window which displays everything in our scene. The first thing we need to know is how to move around in the viewport. There are three ways of moving around in Blender: orbiting, panning, and zooming. To orbit, we can hold down the middle mouse button and drag the mouse around to orbit around our scene. To pan, we can hold down the Shift key and middle mouse button and again drag the mouse around to pan around our scene. Lastly, to zoom, we can either hold down the Control key and middle mouse button and drag our mouse to zoom, or an easy alternative is just to scroll the middle mouse button to zoom in and out. So just to recap, we can orbit with the middle mouse button, pan with the Shift key and middle mouse button, and zoom by scrolling the middle mouse wheel. So now we know how to get around in our scene. The next thing we are going to go through are the buttons around the screen. Because there are a lot of them, it can appear quite intimidating to someone who is new to 3D modelling. So we are going to start off with the buttons on the left hand side of the screen. These are essentially a list of transformation tools and other helpful bits. The first button we have is the selection mode. By default it should be under box selection. I will show you what this looks like. If I hold down the left mouse button in the scene and drag my mouse, you can see that I am creating a box selection on the screen. If I deselect, it will cancel the action. If I was to draw a selection over an object on the screen, it would select that object. For example, if I wanted to select these three objects that we see on the screen, I can get my box selection by holding down the left mouse button, dragging over them, and selecting them. Now that we know how to select objects, let's go back to the sidebar. If I hold down the left mouse button over the selection icon, it'll bring up a list of different selection modes. I don't want to spend too long on this video going through every selection mode, as you'll be using the box selection mainly anyway, but feel free to try out the other selection tools if you wish. Remember, you can always come back here, hold down the left mouse button on the icon, and change your selection mode back. The next button is the cursor icon. If you look on our scene, you will see a small red and white circle. This is called the 3D cursor, but it is also known as the point of origin. With this button selected on the sidebar, you can simply move the cursor wherever you want in the scene. The purpose of this cursor is to determine the point of origin of a new mesh. So just an example, if I select over here, it'll move the 3D cursor to that position, and now if I create a mesh, the mesh will be created on top of that 3D cursor. Again, I can create the 3D cursor over here, create another mesh, it gets created over there. Before we move on, I'm just going to delete the meshes that I made. I can either select a mesh and click the delete key, or I can click Ctrl and Z to undo a recent action. I'm going to do this a few times to remove the newest meshes. Now let's go back to the sidebar. The next icons to look at are the transformation buttons: Move, Rotate, Scale, and Transform. Let's just worry about the first three for now. So if I click the Move button to start with, and then select our cube in our scene, you can see that we have a movement gizmo that appears. Just to quickly explain, this thing here with the arrows and the white circle, this is called a gizmo. We can hold down the left mouse button on one of these arrows and move the cube in any direction we want. Red is the x-axis, green is the y-axis, and blue is the z-axis. Okay, so we know how to move our cube. Let's go back to the sidebar and select the rotate icon now. This time a rotation gizmo appears. And again, we can drag on any of the points here and rotate in a certain axes. Let's look at the scale button now, but I'm just going to undo the recent changes I've just done to the cube by doing Ctrl Z a couple of times. If we come over to the scale button, a scale gizmo now appears. Again, you can hold the left mouse button on the arrow to scale in any direction. Also, if you select within the white circle but outside of these arrows, so around here for example, you can do something called a uniform scale, where it scales on every axis uniformly. If we go back to the sidebar, you will see the transform icon now. All this does is make a gizmo with all of the transform tools combined. You can use this if you want. I personally don't use it as I find it to be a bit over the top for what I'm trying to do. But as you can see, it has our movement, our rotation, and our scaling. Coming away from the transformation tools now, our next icon on the list is the Annotate tool, which simply allows you to write on the screen in 3D space. As you can see. The next one is the Measure tool, which allows you to measure a distance on the screen in meters. You can undo the line just by clicking Ctrl and Z. And lastly, we have the Shape Creation tool, which by default is Cube Creation, or Add Cube. However, if we hold down the left mouse button on this icon, we can choose from a number of shapes. For example, if we select the cone, and then hold the left mouse button down in our scene, we can start creating the cone shape. If we deselect, it will allow us to do the second part of the shape creation process. So that is essentially all of the buttons explained on the left-hand side of the screen. I am now going to go through the right-hand side of the screen, but before I do that, I am just going to come back to the box selection by clicking the selection icon up here, just so that I don't accidentally create another shape, and I'm also going to undo my recent changes by clicking Ctrl and Z a few times. The first area I want to draw your attention to is this section of the screen. The first icon allows us to toggle the visibility of specific things in our scene. For example, if I set the eye icon next to the mesh, it will hide everything in our scene that is a mesh. Now for the arrow, what this essentially does is it stops us selecting anything of that object type. So if I select the arrow next to mesh, you'll see that I cannot select the mesh. I can select the light and I can select the camera, but not the mesh. The next icon is the gizmo icon. All this essentially does is hide and unhide the gizmo. So for example, if I was on the move gizmo mode, and I click this icon here, I can just toggle the gizmo on and off. Similar with this button here with the overlay, this allows me to toggle the overlay on and off. This next icon here just toggles X-ray mode, which does exactly what you would expect. Allows us to see through our objects. Now, the next icons here are very important. They are the viewport shading options. which allow us to see our scene in a different way. Think of it as switching between a different set of eyes. By default, we view our scene in solid mode, which is the base 3D modelling mode, where no colour is displayed, and we only see the grey colours on our mesh as you see now. The view to the left of this is the wireframe view, which allows us to see the skeleton of the meshes on our scene. The other views we have here are the material preview and render preview views. I'm going to come back to solid mode, and I'm also going to quickly create a material for this cube to showcase these other views a bit better. Do not worry about what I am going to do here, as we will learn about material creation in another video. Right, so with a material applied to our cube, if I come over to the material preview, you will see our cube now shows the colour associated to it. And if I change the colour, you can see it changes dynamically on the screen. The last one here is the render preview, which essentially just shows the scene in a rendered mode. A render is essentially a technique of using advanced computing calculations to make the scene appear more realistic. We will learn more about rendering in another video. For now, let's switch back to the solid mode and navigate a bit further to the right. So the right hand side of the screen is split into three parts: the scene collection, the properties tabs, and the properties details window. In this video, we are just going to talk about the scene collection. The reason for this is that these other two areas, the properties tabs and the properties details windows, require a bit more of an in-depth explanation, and I don't want to make this video too lengthy. So with the scene collection, if I was to select the camera here, you can see that the camera is now selected on our scene. If I select the cube is now selected. So as you can see, this is simply just listing out everything that exists on the scene. These eye icons here toggle the visibility of the object. So for example, if I was to click the eye next to the cube, it will hide the cube from our scene. It doesn't delete it, it just hides it. If I click the eye icon again, it reappears in our scene. The next thing I want to cover is the topmost tabs. For the most part, you don't really need to worry too much about what you see up here. Render contains rendering details, edit allows you to edit different preferences in Blender. Window and help you probably will either never use or use very rarely, and these tabs we will cover in very brief detail in a moment. First of all, the File tab. The File tab allows you to create a new file, open other Blender files, save Blender files, or even import or export other files. Let's start by creating a new file and give ourselves a fresh scene to work with. Come over to New, General, Don't Save, and now we have a new scene to work with. Now for these tabs. All these are basically different ways to view Blender. For example, if you want to do some sculpting in Blender, you may come over to the sculpting view, where it gives you everything you need to sculpt here on the screen. Same thing with animation. If you wanted to animate in Blender, you can come here and you have all the animation things you need. Like I said, these are simply just views to make life easier for us. Everything you see on these tabs is possible even on the Layout tab. The last thing I want to cover on this video is the bottom part of the screen here, which a lot of you may have already noticed. This is a timeline and will be used mostly for animation inside of Blender, but it will also come in handy with physics. which again we will talk about on later videos. If I click the spacebar, the timeline starts to play. If I click the spacebar again, it stops. I can then take this blue marker and drag it with the left mouse button back to the start. So far in this video, we have covered all of the main elements of the Blender view that we are accustomed with as we open a new scene. In the next video, we will go a little bit more in depth into the properties tabs and their details windows. I hope this video was helpful, and feel free to rewatch the video if you need to recap on anything before we move on. I will see you in the next video.